Puerto Hurraco is a name that in Spain evokes something more than a point on the map. It is a name that carries with it the weight of a tragedy that for decades seemed inevitable to those who watched it unfold, and absolutely unthinkable to those who only learned of it after it had already happened. It is the name of a place where time stopped one night in August 1990, and where the consequences of what happened that night continue to reverberate in the collective memory of a country that never fully understood how such a thing could have occurred. To understand what happened in Puerto Hurraco, one must go back much further than the day of the events themselves. One must immerse oneself in a world that barely exists anymore, a world of isolated villages in deep Spain, of grudges inherited from generation to generation, of silences that became impenetrable walls between families who shared the same dusty streets, the same relentless sun, the same poverty. Puerto Hurraco is located in the province of Badajoz, in Extremadura, that region which for centuries was synonymous with poverty and abandonment in the Spanish imagination. At the end of the 20th century, while the rest of Spain was beginning to modernize at an accelerated pace, places like Puerto Hurraco remained anchored in an earlier time, almost medieval in their social structures, their codes of honor, the way conflicts took root and were passed down from fathers to sons like a cursed inheritance. The village was never large. At its peak, it barely exceeded a few hundred inhabitants. By 1990, the population had shrunk considerably, a victim of the emigration that was emptying Spain's rural villages, while the cities grew and promised opportunities that the countryside could no longer offer. Those who remained were, for the most part, those who could not or would not leave, the elderly who had been born there and would die there, and a few families who, for various reasons, had put down roots too deep to be pulled up. Among those families were the Izquierdos and the Cabanillas, two names that, in the context of Puerto Hurraco, represented much more than simple lineages. They represented the two poles of a conflict that had been poisoning itself for decades, a conflict that had begun for reasons that almost no one remembered with precision anymore, but which had grown until it became the axis around which the social life of the village revolved. And the exact origins of the hostility between the two families are lost in the fog of time and contradictory versions. Some trace it back to land disputes, those parcels of parched earth that in Extremadura meant the difference between subsistence and absolute destitution. Others speak of unpaid debts, broken promises, small affronts that magnified over the years until they became unforgivable offenses. There are those who mention a failed courtship, a relationship between a member of one family and another from the other that ended badly and left scars that never healed. What is clear is that by the middle of the 20th century, the hostility between the Izquierdos and the Cabanillas was already an established fact in Puerto Hurraco. It was not a secret. It was not something that was hidden. But it was simply part of the social landscape of the village, as present and as accepted as the summer heat or the dryness of the fields. The Izquierdo family was composed of several siblings, but those who would be the protagonists of the events of August 1990 were mainly two, Emilio and Antonio. Living with them was their sister Jerónima, a woman who, according to testimonies from the time, exercised considerable influence over her brothers, a dominant presence in a family where power dynamics had configured themselves in peculiar ways. The Izquierdo brothers were known in the village for their difficult character, their tendency toward isolation, a latent hostility that seemed to emanate from them even during the most everyday interactions. They were not sociable people. They did not participate in community life more than was strictly necessary, and when they did, they generally left behind a trail of discomfort and tension. Emilio, the elder of the two brothers who would perpetrate the massacre, was a man who had spent much of his adult life away from Puerto Hurraco. He had emigrated, like so many other Extremadurans of his generation, seeking work in other parts of Spain. But he had returned, and that return marked a turning point in the escalation of the conflict. Some neighbors would later remember that after his return, the tension in the village had intensified perceptibly, as if his presence had reactivated something that had been dormant, waiting. Antonio, the younger brother, was perhaps the more problematic of the two, at least in terms of visible behavior. He had a history of conflicts with neighbors, of threats uttered in moments of anger, of a contained violence that sometimes overflowed in episodes that the village had learned to absorb and forget. As so many things are absorbed and forgotten in small communities where everyone depends on everyone else, and where reporting a neighbor is equivalent to reporting someone with whom you will have to continue living for the rest of your life. Geronima, the sister, was a more difficult figure to classify. Testimonies about her vary considerably. Some describe her as a victim of her brothers, a woman trapped in a dysfunctional family who had no choice but to adapt to the circumstances. Others suggest that she was the one who fed the resentment, who kept alive the flame of hatred toward the Cabanillas, who constantly reminded her brothers of the affronts suffered and the need for revenge. What seems clear is that the Izquierdo family lived in an increasingly pronounced state of isolation, an isolation that fed on both their own hostility toward the world and the rejection that the world returned to them. They were an island of resentment in a small village, and that island was growing, solidifying, preparing itself for something that no one wanted to name, but that many sensed. The Cabanillas, for their part, were a family more integrated into village life. They were not rich. No one was rich in Puerto Hurraco. But they had a relatively stable position, relationships with other neighbors, a social presence that the Izquierdos did not have and did not seem to desire. This difference in social status, however minimal in absolute terms, and probably contributed to aggravating the conflict. For the Izquierdos, the Cabanillas represented not only the historical enemies, but also those who had prospered while they languished, those who were accepted while they were rejected. The Izquierdos' resentment toward the Cabanillas was not an abstract sentiment. It manifested itself in concrete actions, in incidents that accumulated over the years like layers of sediment. There were fights, there were threats, there were moments when violence erupted and then was contained, leaving behind wounds that never quite closed. One of the most significant episodes in the history of the conflict occurred years before the massacre, when a dispute between members of both families ended with tragic consequences. The exact details vary according to the sources, but what is documented is that there was a death, a member of the Izquierdo family, who lost his life in circumstances related to the confrontation between the two families. This event marked a before and after in the intensity of the hatred. For the Izquierdos, that death became the supreme offense, the affront that demanded a proportional response. It did not matter what had happened before. It did not matter what provocations might have existed on one side or the other. What mattered was that an Izquierdo had died, and that the Cabanillas were directly or indirectly responsible for that death. The judicial system intervened at that time, as it had intervened on previous occasions, when the conflicts between the families had escalated to the point of requiring the attention of the authorities. There were trials. There were convictions. there was what the state considers justice. But for the izquierdos, that official justice was insufficient. It was a mockery. It was a way of protecting the guilty, while the victims remained without reparation. This perception of injustice, that the system was on the side of the cabanillas, that the institutions would do nothing to compensate for the harm suffered, crystallized in the Izquierdo brothers until it became an absolute certainty. If official justice was useless, then they would have to seek another form of justice. If the authorities would not punish the guilty, then they would take care of it themselves. What makes the Puerto Hurraco case particularly disturbing is precisely this. It was not a sudden explosion of madness. It was not a moment of transitory alienation. It was the result of a long, visible, documented process. The Izquierdo brothers did not hide their intentions. They manifested them openly, repeatedly, over years. They said on multiple occasions and to multiple people what they planned to do. And no one did anything to stop them. The Izquierdo's threats were known in Puerto Hurraco. They were known to the neighbors. They were known to the cabanillas. They were known to the local authorities. Emilio and Antonio had declared without ambiguity that they would kill the cabanillas, that they would exterminate them, that they would finish off the entire family, leaving no one alive. These threats were not whispers in the darkness. They were public declarations, made in bars, in the street, wherever someone was willing to listen, or even where no one wanted to. The Izquierdo brothers spoke of their plan for revenge with a chilling naturalness, as if they were discussing the weather or the harvest. The question that inevitably arises is why no one acted. Why, in the face of such explicit and repeated threats, no authority intervened to prevent what seemed increasingly inevitable? The answer to that question is complex and reveals much about rural Spain of the era, about the limitations of the justice system, about the way small communities process internal conflicts. In part, the inaction was due to a systematic underestimation of the threat. The authorities, the neighbors, even the cabanillas themselves, had heard the Izquierdo's threats so many times that they had stopped taking them seriously. They had become background noise, something that was part of the daily landscape, but that no one really believed would materialize. The Izquierdos had been threatening for years, and the years passed without anything happening. It was easy to convince oneself that it would continue that way, that the threats were just words, expressions of an impotent resentment that would never translate into action. This normalization of threats is one of the most disturbing aspects of the case. It shows how communities can become accustomed to living with danger, how they can integrate the unacceptable into their daily routine until it stops seeming unacceptable. The neighbors of Puerto Hurraco knew that the Izquierdos hated the cabanillas. They knew they had threatened to kill them, and they continued with their lives, because what else could they do? Because reporting a neighbor for verbal threats seemed excessive, because no one wanted to be the one who would escalate a conflict that had been rooted for decades. One must also consider the institutional context of the era. The Spain of 1990 was very different from today's Spain in many respects, including the capacity and willingness of the authorities to intervene in family or neighborhood conflicts. Security forces in rural areas were limited, resources scarce, and there existed a tradition of non-interference in matters considered private or communal. Verbal threats, however serious, rarely translated into concrete preventive actions. The cabanillas, for their part, lived with the knowledge that they were the target of the Izquierdos' hatred. They were not naive, they were not unaware of the danger, but they could not abandon their lives, their homes, their livelihoods, because of threats they had been hearing for years without anything happening. They had adapted to living under that shadow, like so many others who live with threats that seem permanent but never materialize. Until they materialize. The years leading up to 1990 witnessed a gradual but perceptible escalation of the conflict. The incidents became more frequent, the tensions more visible, the atmosphere more charged. Some neighbors would later remember having felt that something terrible was approaching, a diffuse but persistent premonition that the situation could not be sustained indefinitely, that someday the precarious balance would break. There were specific warning signs in the months before the massacre. The Izquierdo brothers began to behave in ways that, viewed in retrospect, were clearly preparatory. They made comments about weapons, about ammunition, about plans that were maturing. Some of these comments were heard by people who would later testify before the authorities. People who would acknowledge that, yes, they had heard things, that they had suspected something, but that they had done nothing because they did not know what to do, because they did not want to get involved, because they thought they were exaggerating. The acquisition of the weapons that would be used in the massacre is a particularly dark chapter of this story. The Izquierdo brothers obtained hunting shotguns, weapons that in the rural Spain of that era were relatively accessible, and whose possession was much less regulated than today. There was nothing illegal in that acquisition, or at least nothing that the authorities detected or considered cause for concern. They were countrymen with hunting shotguns, something completely normal in that context. But those shotguns were not destined for hunting rabbits or partridges. They were destined for a purpose that their owners had repeatedly announced, and that no one had taken seriously enough. They were destined for the revenge that the Izquierdos had been promising for years, and that they would finally carry out. The summer of 1990 arrived in Extremadura, with the relentless heat as always. The days were long, the nights hot, and life in Puerto Hurraco followed its slow and predictable rhythm. Neighbors gathered in the streets when the sun went down, seeking the coolness that the interiors of the houses could not offer. Children played, adults conversed, and the village seemed, superficially, a tranquil place where nothing extraordinary was happening. August is traditionally a month of festivities in Spanish villages. They are the patron saint festivals, the celebrations that mark the high point of summer, when emigrants return to their places of origin, and the villages temporarily recover some of the vitality that emigration has stolen from them. Puerto Hurraco was no exception. The village festivities were celebrated in August, and with them came an atmosphere of reunion and celebration that contrasted markedly with the routine of the rest of the year. August 26, 1990, was a Sunday. The festivities were in full swing, and the village was buzzing with unusual activity. There was dancing in the plaza, there was music, there were families gathered enjoying the summer and each other's company. Among those families were the cabanillas, who were participating in the celebrations like any other inhabitant of the village. What the cabanillas did not know, what no one knew for certain, was that that night the Izquierdo brothers had decided that the moment had come. After years of threats, of preparation, of feeding a hatred that had grown until it consumed everything, they had determined that it was time to act. The reasons why they chose precisely that night are not entirely clear, perhaps because the festivities gathered many members of the Cabanillas family in the same place. Perhaps because the confusion and the bustle provided cover that other moments did not offer. Perhaps simply because, after so many years of waiting, something in them broke, and they decided they could wait no longer. Night was falling over Puerto Hurraco while the celebrations continued. The plaza was full of people. The atmosphere was festive, and no one was paying particular attention to the Izquierdo brothers when they left their house armed with the shotguns they had been keeping for this moment. What followed was a slaughter that marked Puerto Hurraco forever, and that shook all of Spain. The Izquierdo brothers opened fire on the cabanillas and on anyone who was near them. There was no warning, there was no negotiation, there was no chance to escape. There was only the crack of gunshots tearing through the summer night, the screams of terror, the absolute chaos of a crowd that suddenly found itself in the middle of a massacre. The violence lasted minutes, but those minutes were enough to irrevocably change the history of the village. When it ended, when the Izquierdo brothers finally stopped shooting, the ground of Puerto Hurraco was strewn with bodies. 9 people had died, among them several members of the Cabanillas family, and other victims who simply had the misfortune of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Many others had been wounded, some seriously. Among the dead there were women, there were elderly people, there were people whose only connection to the conflict was sharing a surname with the Izquierdo's enemies, or being too close when the shooting started. The revenge that the brothers had promised for years did not distinguish between guilty and innocent, if such a distinction made any sense in a conflict where guilt had diffused and been transmitted through generations. And the village was plunged into shock. The survivors, many of them wounded, were trying to understand what had just happened, while emergency services began arriving from neighboring towns. Puerto Hurraco, a place that most Spaniards probably would not have been able to locate on a map before that night, suddenly became the center of attention for the entire country. The Izquierdo brothers did not try to flee after the massacre. They retreated to their house, where they remained while security forces surrounded the building and began negotiations that would last for hours. The siege of the Izquierdo house added another layer of tension to an already extreme situation, with the entire country waiting to see how this crisis would be resolved. Jeronima, the sister, was with them in the house. Her exact role in the events of that night would always be subject to debate. There is no evidence that she personally fired, but her presence alongside her brothers during the siege, and her history of complicity in cultivating the family resentment, would make her a central figure in the tragedy. The negotiations with the Izquierdo brothers were complicated by the mental state of the besieged and by the prevailing confusion. Finally, after hours of tension, the brothers surrendered to the authorities. They were arrested and transferred under heavy escort, while Puerto Hurraco began the long process of burying its dead and trying to understand the incomprehensible. The images from that night and the following days remained etched in the Spanish collective memory. The media descended on Puerto Hurraco, transforming the small Extremaduran village into the scene of unprecedented media coverage. Journalists from all over Spain, and soon from other countries, arrived in that remote place to document the tragedy and try to explain how it had been possible. What they found was a devastated village, a community that had been small before, and that now seemed even smaller, more vulnerable, more exposed. The neighbors who had not been physically wounded carried invisible wounds that would take years to begin to heal, if they ever did. Many of them knew both the victims and the perpetrators. In a village of that size, everyone knows everyone, and the massacre had torn the social fabric in ways that were difficult to process. The funerals of the victims were ceremonies of collective mourning that gathered not only the inhabitants of Puerto Hurraco, but also people from neighboring villages and representatives of regional and national authorities. All of Spain seemed to be in mourning, shaken by a violence that seemed to belong to another era, another place, not to a Spanish village at the end of the 20th century. The trial that followed was long and complex. The Izquierdo brothers were charged with multiple counts of homicide and other related offenses. Their defense lawyers argued that they suffered from mental disorders affecting their ability to understand the gravity of their acts, an argument that would be partially accepted by the courts. Emilio Izquierdo was declared not criminally responsible due to mental alienation, which meant that, according to the expert's evaluation, he could not be considered fully responsible for his acts due to his psychological state at the time of committing them. He was committed to a psychiatric penitentiary facility, where he would remain until his death years later. Antonio Izquierdo, although he was also recognized as having mitigating circumstances for his mental problems, was considered partially responsible and sentenced to a long prison term. He would spend the rest of his life in penitentiary and psychiatric institutions, never returning to Puerto Hurraco. Jerónima Izquierdo was tried for her possible participation as an instigator or accomplice to the crimes. Her case was particularly controversial, as determining her degree of responsibility for acts she had not materially committed proved legally complex. She was ultimately convicted, though with a lesser sentence than her brother Antonio, for having contributed to creating the climate of hatred that led to the massacre. The trial attracted enormous media attention and served as partial catharsis for a country that needed to understand what had happened. The testimonies of the survivors, the neighbors, the forensic psychiatry experts were dissected by the media and debated by public opinion. Spain was looking at itself in the mirror of Puerto Hurraco and did not like what it saw. Because Puerto Hurraco, beyond the specific horror of the facts, raised uncomfortable questions about rural Spain, about the abandonment of the interior regions, about the persistence of archaic social structures in the midst of modernity, about the state's capacity to protect citizens from threats that were public and known. It was easier to see the Izquierdo brothers as monsters, as aberrations, than to accept that they were the product of circumstances that the country had allowed to perpetuate. The debate about the Izquierdo brothers' mental health was particularly intense. The expert reports described Emilio and Antonio as persons with serious personality disorders, with a distorted perception of reality, with an inability to process the conflict with the Cabanillas in a rational manner. But other experts and many citizens wondered whether those diagnoses were not a way of evading responsibility, of turning assassins into sick people, and thus avoiding the more difficult questions about why no one had intervened earlier. And could the question of collective responsibility hung over the entire judicial process and the subsequent public debate. If the Izquierdo brothers had repeatedly announced their intentions, if their threats were known to everyone, if the conflict with the Cabanillas was public and notorious, then the responsibility for what had happened could not rest solely on those who pulled the trigger. There was a chain of omissions, of negligences, of looking the other way, that had allowed the tragedy to be consummated. This chain included the neighbors who had heard the threats and had not reported them, or had not insisted when the authorities did not act. It included the local authorities who knew about the conflict and had not taken effective preventive measures. It included a judicial system that, after previous incidents between the families, had not been able to defuse a time bomb that was still ticking. It included, ultimately, a society that had normalized verbal violence, death threats, rooted hatred, until that hatred materialized in the most terrible way possible. The impact of Puerto Hurraco on the Spanish consciousness was profound and lasting. The name of the village became synonymous with rural tragedy, with atavistic violence, with the dangers of resentment accumulated over generations. For years, any reference to Puerto Hurraco immediately evoked the images of that August night, the faces of the victims, the horror of a massacre that seemed to belong to another century. The village itself remained indelibly marked. The population, already declining before the massacre, shrank even further in the following years. Many of those who could leave did so, unable to continue living in a place where every corner, every house, every street reminded them of what had happened. Those who stayed had to learn to live with the memory of the dead and with the ghostly presence of the absent, both those who had been murdered and those who had fled from a village that would never again be what it was. The houses of the Izquierdos and the Cabanillas remained for years as mute witnesses to the tragedy. Some were abandoned, left at the mercy of time and deterioration. Others were occupied by new inhabitants who were trying, perhaps, to start anew in a place where starting anew seemed almost impossible. Puerto Hurraco also became an object of study for sociologists, psychologists, criminologists, and other researchers who sought to understand what had failed and what social and psychological mechanisms had led to that explosion of violence. The studies carried out in the years after the massacre contributed to a better understanding of risk factors in prolonged conflicts, of the importance of early intervention, of the dangers of normalizing threats. But for the inhabitants of Puerto Hurraco, for the survivors and the families of the victims, these academic studies offered little comfort. They lived with the concrete consequences of that night, with the interminable mourning, with the trauma that manifested itself in diverse and often unpredictable ways. Some developed post-traumatic stress disorders that would accompany them for decades. Others found ways to move forward, to rebuild their lives, but always with the shadow of Puerto Hurraco projecting itself over everything they did. The children who witnessed the massacre grew up marked by what they had seen. Some were too young to fully understand what was happening that night, but the images, the sounds, the terror of the adults around them remained engraved in their memory, in ways that were not always accessible to consciousness. As they grew up, many of them had to deal with the aftermath of a trauma they had not chosen, and that they simply could not forget. The media coverage of Puerto Hurraco also left its mark on the way Spain processed violent crimes. It was one of the first cases in which the mass media, especially television, covered an event of this nature with such intensity and for so long. The images of the village, of the funerals, of the trial, were broadcast again and again, creating a visual narrative that became embedded in the collective memory. This coverage had contradictory effects. On one hand, it contributed to making visible a problem that might otherwise have been relegated to the inside pages of local newspapers. Puerto Hurraco was not Madrid or Barcelona. It was a village lost in Extremadura that most Spaniards had never heard of. Without the media attention, the massacre might have been forgotten much more quickly, its lessons lost. On the other hand, the intensity of the coverage had problematic aspects. There were moments when the line between information and spectacle blurred, when the pain of the victims and their families seemed to become material for morbid entertainment. Survivors complained of feeling harassed by journalists seeking statements, images, anything that could feed the apparently insatiable appetite of the public for details of the tragedy. Yet the Puerto Hurraco case also generated an intense debate about gun legislation in Spain. Although the shotguns used by the Izquierdo brothers were legal weapons whose possession was permitted, the ease with which persons with a history of violent threats had been able to access them raised uncomfortable questions. In the following years, some aspects of firearms regulations would be tightened, although establishing a direct relationship between Puerto Hurraco and these legislative changes is difficult. What is clear is that Puerto Hurraco contributed to greater awareness of the risks of rural violence, of the need to take verbal threats seriously, of the importance of intervening in rooted conflicts before they escalate to the point of no return. Whether these lessons were really learned or simply forgotten over time is another question. But at least for a period, Puerto Hurraco served as a warning of what could happen when danger signs were ignored. The history of the Izquierdo family after the massacre is also part of this narrative. Emilio, committed to the psychiatric penitentiary facility, lived his last years in a state of progressive mental deterioration. He died without ever having left the institution, without ever having seen Puerto Hurraco again, without ever having expressed, at least publicly, regret for what he had done. His death passed relatively unnoticed by the general public, a footnote to a story that had long since left the headlines. Antonio followed a similar path, although he lived longer than his brother. Had he moved from penitentiary to psychiatric institutions and back, depending on his mental state at any given time. Those who knew him in those institutions described a man who seemed to live in his own world, disconnected from the reality around him, unable or unwilling to process the magnitude of what he had done. Jeronima, after serving her sentence, became the last survivor of the Izquierdo family, directly involved in the events. Her life after prison was discreet, away from the media spotlight that had so harshly illuminated her family during the trial. She died years later, and with her went the last person who could have offered an insider's perspective on what had led her brothers to commit that massacre. The question of what was going through the Izquierdo brothers' minds, and of how they had reached the point of being able to cold-bloodedly kill 9 people, including women and elderly people, never received a fully satisfactory answer. The psychiatric reports offered clinical diagnoses, but diagnoses do not explain everything. There is something in the act of killing that escapes medical categories, something that has to do with choices, with values, with a humanity that has eroded to the point of disappearing. The survivors of the Cabanillas family had to rebuild their lives with the weight of having lost loved ones in the most violent way possible. Some stayed in Puerto Hurraco, others moved to cities where they could start over, where their surname did not immediately evoke the tragedy. But wherever you go, you carry with you what you have lived. And what the surviving Cabanillas had lived through was something that cannot be left behind simply by changing your address. The Cabanillas' mourning was a mourning complicated by multiple factors. Not only had they lost family members, but they had lost them in circumstances that had been broadcast on television to the entire country, dissected in the newspapers, debated in bars and talk shows. Their private pain had become a public spectacle, and that added an additional layer of complexity to a process that was already devastating. There was also the question of justice, or of what the survivors perceived as its absence. For many families of the victims, the sentences handed down against the Izquierdo brothers were insufficient, especially the declaration of Emilio's non-criminal responsibility. They understood, perhaps, the technical arguments about mental capacity and criminal responsibility, but understanding is not the same as accepting. They felt that their loved ones had died and that no one would really pay for it, at least not in the way that human justice traditionally conceives of payment. This feeling of injustice persisted for years, feeding a resentment that, ironically, was not so different from the resentment that had consumed the Izquierdos. The cycle of violence has that perverse characteristic. It generates in the victims emotions that are structurally similar to those that motivated the perpetrators. The survivors had to fight against that cycle, against the temptation to let themselves be consumed by hatred, against the possibility of becoming themselves prisoners of a resentment that would rob them of what remained of their lives. Some succeeded better than others. There were those who found ways to process the trauma, to integrate what had happened into a life narrative that allowed them to move forward. There were those who received professional help, psychological therapy, that gave them tools to deal with grief and trauma. And there were those who never got over it, who lived the rest of their lives in a kind of emotional limbo, unable to leave behind that August night. Puerto Hurraco, as a physical place, continued to exist after the massacre, but it was a deeply transformed village. The demographics changed, the social dynamics changed, even the urban landscape changed, as houses stood empty, and others were renovated by new inhabitants who had no direct connection to the events. To occasional visitors, Puerto Hurraco might look like any other Extremaduran village, with its plaza, its church, its narrow streets. But for those who knew its history, every corner evoked something. Every space was charged with meaning. The plaza where the massacre took place was particularly difficult to resignify. It was the heart of the village, the place where people gathered, where festivities were celebrated, where social life unfolded. Transforming it back into a space of encounter and celebration, after it had been the scene of so much death, required a collective effort that took years. Some proposed erecting some kind of memorial. Others preferred that there be nothing to remind of what had happened, that the village could somehow turn the page. And this debate about memory and forgetting is recurrent in communities that have suffered collective traumas. There is no correct answer. There is no universally valid way of processing the past. Some need to remember, to name the victims, to keep their memory alive as a way of honoring them and preventing something similar from happening again in the future. Others need to forget, or at least not be constantly confronted with reminders of what they prefer to leave behind. In Puerto Hurraco, as in so many other places marked by tragedy, these two needs coexisted and sometimes came into conflict. With the passage of years, Puerto Hurraco gradually faded from the media spotlight. Other tragedies, other scandals, other news occupied the space that the small Extremaduran village had once filled. For the general public, Puerto Hurraco became a historical reference, something that had happened a long time ago, and that was vaguely remembered when a similar case arose, when some neighborhood conflict escalated to violence, when someone uttered the phrase, "This could end up like Puerto Hurraco." That phrase, which has become almost an idiomatic expression, is perhaps the most lasting legacy of the massacre in colloquial Spanish. When one wants to warn about the dangers of a conflict that is becoming entrenched, when one wants to signal that a situation is reaching a point of no return, Puerto Hurraco is invoked as an example of what can happen. It is a way of keeping the memory of the tragedy alive, although in an indirect and sometimes superficial way. But beyond colloquial expressions, in Puerto Hurraco left lessons that deserve to be remembered with more depth. Lessons about the importance of taking threats of violence seriously, however repeated and seemingly empty they may seem. Lessons about the dangers of normalization, of getting used to living with conflict until the conflict explodes. Lessons about the responsibility of communities and institutions to intervene before it is too late. Also lessons about the nature of resentment, about how it can grow and feed on itself until it becomes something monstrous. The Izquierdo brothers were not born killers. They formed themselves as such over decades, nourished by a hatred that they themselves cultivated, but that was also cultivated by circumstances, by real or perceived grievances, and by a social system that did not know or did not want to offer them other ways of processing the conflict. This is not an excuse for what they did. Nothing can excuse the murder of 9 innocent people, but it is an explanation, or at least part of one. And explanations matter, because only by understanding how tragedies happen can we hope to prevent them in the future. The Puerto Hurraco case also illustrates the limits of formal justice. The judicial system did what it could with the Izquierdo brothers. It tried them, convicted them, or declared them not responsible as legally appropriate, removed them from society so they could do no more harm. But formal justice cannot undo what has been done, cannot give life back to the dead, cannot repair the damage caused to the survivors. There is something fundamentally unsatisfying about any judicial response to a crime of this magnitude. A feeling that, however severe the sentence, it will never be proportionate to the horror of what happened. This dissatisfaction is not a defect of the justice system, but an inevitable feature of any human system that attempts to respond to extreme violence. Perfect justice does not exist, and pretending it does only leads to frustration. What justice can do is set limits, signal that certain acts are unacceptable and will have consequences, offer some kind of closure, however imperfect, to the victims and to society. In the case of Puerto Hurraco, the judicial system fulfilled these functions in a reasonable, though inevitably incomplete manner. More than 3 decades after that August night in 1990, Puerto Hurraco continues to exist as a village, though deeply transformed. The population has continued to decline, following the general trend of rural depopulation that affects much of interior Spain. Those who remain are mostly elderly people who were born there and will probably die there, along with a few young people who, for various reasons, have decided to stay or return. The village has tried, as far as possible, to build an identity that goes beyond the massacre. They do not want to be remembered only as the place where that happened, though they know that for many Spaniards, that is exactly what they are. It is a difficult, almost impossible struggle to change the narrative associated with a name that has been engraved in the collective memory in such a specific and terrible way. Journalists and curious visitors continue to visit Puerto Hurraco occasionally, attracted by the macabre fame of the place. Some residents talk to them, others prefer not to. There are those who think that keeping the memory of what happened alive is important, that forgetting would be a second death for the victims. Others think it is time to turn the page, that the village cannot live forever under the shadow of that night, that the living have the right to build a future that is not completely determined by the past. The anniversaries of the massacre are commemorated in various ways. Some years there are public events, others pass more unnoticed. The families of the victims have their own rituals of remembrance, more private, more intimate. With the passage of time, fewer and fewer people remain who lived through the events directly, fewer and fewer first-hand witnesses, and the massacre is gradually becoming history, something that happened a long time ago, and that is known mainly through accounts, documents, reports. This process of historicization is inevitable and, in a way, healthy. Communities cannot live forever in trauma. They need to find ways of integrating the past that allow them to continue functioning in the present. But historicization also carries risks, especially the risk that lessons will be forgotten. that what was once urgent will become merely interesting, that the intensity of the horror will dilute until it becomes an abstraction without emotional weight. That is why it is important to continue telling this story, to continue making it relevant for each new generation. Not because we should obsess over the past, but because the past has things to teach us about the present and the future. The conditions that produced Puerto Hurraco still exist to some degree. Prolonged conflicts still become entrenched. Threats still are ignored. Silence still is the most convenient response to uncomfortable situations. As long as this is so, the story of Puerto Hurraco will remain relevant. On the night of August 26th, when the gunshots tore through the festive air and turned a celebration into a nightmare, something broke in Puerto Hurraco that can never be completely repaired. But from the fragments of that rupture, new things have emerged. A deeper understanding of the dangers of accumulated resentment, a greater awareness of the need to intervene in conflicts before they escalate, or a determination not to allow silence to continue to be complicit in violence. These things do not compensate for what was lost, nothing can. But they are something. They are a constructive legacy that can be extracted from destruction. They are a way of giving meaning to what would otherwise be pure meaninglessness. If the tragedy of Puerto Hurraco contributes to preventing even one future tragedy, then the victims will not have died entirely in vain, though that is cold comfort for those who loved them. The resentment that consumed the Izquierdo brothers for decades, that corroded them from within until they became instruments of death, is a warning about the dangers of unprocessed hatred. Hatred is a human emotion, as human as love or joy, and it cannot simply be suppressed or ignored, but it can be processed, it can be transformed, and it can be channeled into forms that do not destroy the one who feels it or those around them. The Izquierdos did not have access to these forms of processing, or if they did not use them. Their hatred fed on itself, grew in the darkness of their isolation, until it became something monstrous. This is not an excuse, but it is an explanation. And the explanation matters, because without it we cannot hope to prevent similar cases in the future. The prevention of extreme violence is a complex task that involves multiple actors, families, communities, institutions, mental health professionals, security forces, the judicial system. None of these actors can do it alone, and coordination among them is often deficient. Puerto Hurraco revealed failures at all these levels, a chain of omissions that allowed the tragedy to be consummated. Improving this coordination, creating more effective systems of detection and response to risk situations, is one of the challenges that Puerto Hurraco left posed. Progress has been made since then, though probably not enough. Violence continues to exist, conflicts continue to become entrenched, tragedies continue to happen. But at least there is greater awareness of the risks, greater willingness to intervene, less tolerance for the normalization of threats. Whether this greater awareness is enough to prevent future tragedies is something only time will tell. What we can say is that Puerto Hurraco contributed to generating it, that the death of 9 people that August night was not completely useless if it served to make others take more seriously the dangers that had been ignored in that case. It is a bitter legacy, but it is a legacy. Puerto Hurraco is still there, in the province of Badajoz, under the relentless sun of Extremadura. It is a small village, smaller all the time, but a village that exists, that resists, that refuses to disappear. Its streets hold the echoes of what happened, but they also hold the sounds of life that continues, the conversations of neighbors, the play of children, the passing of the seasons. The story of what happened there more than 3 decades ago will continue to be told as long as there is someone who wants to hear it. It will continue to be studied, analyzed, debated. It will continue to generate questions that have no easy answers, and answers that do not fully satisfy the questions. It will continue to be a reminder of what can happen when hatred takes root, when threats are ignored, when silence becomes the default way of dealing with conflicts. And perhaps if we pay attention, if we draw the lessons it offers, Puerto Hurraco can also be something more than a reminder of tragedy. It can be a guide to prevention, an example of what not to do, a warning that, however painful, can contribute to avoiding future suffering. That would be the best way to honor the memory of those who died that night, not only by remembering them, but by acting in ways that make it less likely that others will have to be remembered in the same way. Not only by mourning what happened, but by working to ensure it does not happen again. Puerto Hurraco waits under the sky of Extremadura, with its burden of history and its aspiration for the future. It is a small village, smaller all the time, but a village that exists, that resists, that refuses to be reduced to a single night, however terrible that night was. And in that resistance, there is something that deserves to be recognized, something that speaks to the human capacity to survive even the worst, to find ways to continue when everything seems lost. That is perhaps the last lesson of Puerto Hurraco, not the lesson about violence and its causes, not the lesson about prevention and its failures, but the lesson about the persistence of life, about the possibility of reconstruction, about the refusal to be defined solely by trauma. It is a bitter lesson because it emerges from immense pain, but it is a valuable lesson because it points toward hope, even in the midst of despair. Puerto Hurraco is still there, waiting. The silence that followed the gunshots that night was a silence different from any Puerto Hurraco had ever known. It was not the silence of a summer night, peaceful and warm. It was the silence of shock, of incomprehension, of a reality that refused to be processed. The neighbors who had not been wounded stood paralyzed, unable to move, unable to speak, unable to do anything but contemplate the horror that had materialized before their eyes. In that silence, the screams of the wounded sounded strangely distant, as if they came from another world. The sobs of those who had seen their loved ones fall, the chaos of the first attempts at rescue. Everything seemed wrapped in a kind of unreal haze. It was as if the entire village had been torn from normal reality and deposited in a place where the usual rules no longer applied. The emergency services took time to arrive, as always happens in the small, remote villages of rural Spain. Those minutes of waiting were an eternity for the survivors, who were trying to help the wounded with the limited resources they had. They improvised bandages, tried to stop bleeding, held the hands of the dying while waiting for help that seemed never to arrive. When the ambulances and the Guardia Civil finally arrived, Puerto Hurraco became the center of an emergency operation that no one had anticipated. Bodies were identified and transported. The wounded were evacuated to hospitals in the area. Witnesses were questioned in the midst of their state of shock. The village that a few hours earlier had been celebrating its patron saint festivities had transformed into a crime scene. The siege of the Izquierdo house added hours of tension to a night that had already been unbearable. While the brothers remained barricaded, the rest of the village lived in a state of suspension, not knowing whether the violence had ended or could resume at any moment. The fear of those hours, not knowing what would come next, added to the trauma of what had already happened. When the Izquierdos finally surrendered and were arrested, there was no relief. There could not be. The arrest of those responsible did not give life back to the dead, did not erase the images engraved in the memory of the witnesses, did not repair the social fabric that had been torn. It only meant that one phase had ended and another was beginning, perhaps longer and more difficult. The phase of living with the consequences. On the days that followed were a succession of funeral ceremonies that emotionally exhausted an already devastated village. Each funeral was a reminder of what had been lost, each coffin another weight on the shoulders of a community that could barely stand. Neighbors supported each other because there was no other option, because shared pain was the only form of pain they could bear. The presence of the media during those days was overwhelming. Puerto Hurraco, which had never been news for anyone, was suddenly in all the newspapers, in all the news bulletins, in all the conversations. Residents found themselves facing cameras and microphones every time they left their houses, pursued by journalists who wanted statements, reactions, anything that could feed the apparently insatiable demand for information about the tragedy. Some spoke because they felt the need to tell what they had lived through, to bear witness to what had happened. Others took refuge in silence, unable or unwilling to verbalize a pain that was too fresh, too raw. Both reactions were understandable. Both were ways of processing a trauma that exceeded any previous experience. The police investigation proceeded with the thoroughness required by a case of this magnitude. The sequence of events was reconstructed. The weapons used were identified. Statements were taken from all available witnesses. The judicial file was enriched with testimonies, expert reports, psychiatric evaluations, all the documentary apparatus that justice requires to process a crime of these characteristics. But beyond the file, beyond the formal procedures, there was the human reality of what had happened, and a reality that did not fit in official documents, that escaped legal categories, that had to do with pain, with loss, with the irreparable rupture of an order that, however imperfect, was the only one that community knew. The psychologists and social workers who arrived in Puerto Hurraco in the days following the massacre found a community in a state of collective shock. It was not just that specific individuals had been traumatized. It was the entire village that had been traumatized, as if it were a single organism that had suffered an almost mortal wound. Psychological care in disaster situations was not as developed in Spain in 1990 as it would be in later decades. The professionals did what they could with available resources, but many survivors were left without the help they needed, or received it in an insufficient or delayed manner. The consequences of this lack would manifest themselves in the following years in the form of disorders that could have been mitigated with earlier and more intensive intervention. The trial against the Izquierdo brothers, when it finally took place, was an event that once again put Puerto Hurraco at the center of national attention. The courtroom filled with families of the victims, journalists, curious people who wanted to see with their own eyes those responsible for the massacre. The brothers appeared in a state that reflected the mental deterioration that the experts had documented. pathetic figures that were difficult to reconcile with the image of the ruthless assassins who had sown death in the village plaza. The declarations during the trial revealed details about the conflict between the families that had not been widely known until then. There was talk of the previous death that had intensified the Izquierdo's hatred, of the threats they had uttered for years, of the missed opportunities for intervention. For many observers, the trial was as much an opportunity to understand as it was a confirmation of how difficult it is to truly understand what leads human beings to commit acts of this nature. The sentences, when they came, were received with mixed feelings. The declaration of Emilio's non-criminal responsibility was particularly controversial, as many believed that, whatever his mental state, he should pay for what he had done in the same way as any other murderer. Antonio's sentence, though substantial, also did not satisfy those who hoped that justice would somehow equal the gravity of the crimes committed. This dissatisfaction with the judicial response was neither irrational nor capricious. It reflected a deep truth about the limits of any human justice system, that there are crimes so serious that no sentence can seem proportionate, that the very idea of proportionality becomes problematic when it comes to multiple human lives taken. The victims' families had to find ways to live with that dissatisfaction, to accept that perfect justice does not exist, and that they would have to settle for the imperfect justice that the system could offer. With the passage of years, Puerto Hurraco found a balance between remembrance and continuity. The anniversaries continued to be commemorated, but daily life regained its rights. The children born after the massacre grew up, forming a new generation that had not lived through the trauma directly, but had inherited it in indirect ways, through the stories of their parents and grandparents, through the atmosphere of the village, through the fame that continued to accompany the name of Puerto Hurraco, wherever it was mentioned. The depopulation continued, as it continued in so many other villages of emptied Spain. Each year, there were fewer inhabitants, more empty houses, more silent streets. Puerto Hurraco was on its way to becoming one more of the ghost villages that dot the Spanish geography, victim not only of the massacre, but of demographic and economic trends that affected all of rural Spain. But the village resisted, as so many small communities resist, that refused to disappear despite everything. There were those who continued to bet on Puerto Hurraco, who believed it deserved a future as well as a past, who worked to keep alive a place that history had marked, but that did not have to be defined solely by that mark. The landscape of Puerto Hurraco is the landscape of Extremadura, arid, harsh, beautiful in its own way. The fields surrounding the village have been worked for generations, by hands that are no longer there, and continue to be worked by the few hands that remain. The sun that illuminated that night of festivities, turned tragedy, continues to illuminate the days, indifferent to the human history that unfolds beneath its light. In that landscape, in that village, in those streets that were the scene of so much pain, life continues. It continues because it has no other option, and because the living continue to live, and must continue to live, because time passes and carries with it both horror and normality, leaving behind a sediment of memory that changes shape but never completely disappears. Puerto Hurraco is today a name that evokes a tragedy, but it is also a place where people live, work, dream, suffer, and hope, as in any other place in the world. The two realities coexist, the historical and the present, and the inhabitants of the village must constantly navigate between them, being at once guardians of a terrible memory and protagonists of an ordinary life that deserves to be lived. The story of what happened that August night in 1990 has no definitive ending, because the consequences continue to unfold, because the echoes continue to resonate, because the question of what we can learn remains relevant. It is a story that deserves to be told and remembered, not out of morbidity or fascination with horror, but because it contains truths about the human condition that are important not to forget. Puerto Hurraco waits under the sky of Extremadura, with its burden of history and its aspiration for the future. It is a small village, smaller all the time, but a village that exists, that resists, that refuses to be reduced to a single night, however terrible that night was. And in that resistance, there is something that deserves to be recognized, something that speaks to the human capacity to survive even the worst, to find ways to continue when everything seems lost. That is perhaps the final lesson of Puerto Hurraco. Not the lesson about violence and its causes, not the lesson about prevention and its failures, but the lesson about the persistence of life, about the possibility of reconstruction, about the refusal to be defined solely by trauma. It is a bitter lesson because it emerges from immense pain, but it is a valuable lesson because it points toward hope even in the midst of despair. Puerto Hurraco is still there, waiting. Recognizing this normality is important because it helps to humanize a place that has been dehumanized by tragedy. Puerto Hurraco was not a village of monsters before the massacre, and it did not become one after. It was, and is, a village of ordinary people, with the same virtues and defects that are found in any human community. What was extraordinary was what happened that night, not the village itself, or the majority of its inhabitants. The Izquierdo brothers were the exception and the anomaly that occurred in that context, but did not represent it. They were the product of a confluence of factors, personal, family, social, historical, that combined in a lethal way. Understanding this is not excusing them, but it is recognizing that extreme violence rarely arises out of nowhere, that it usually has deep and complex roots that deserve to be studied if we want to prevent it in the future. The question of why the Izquierdos did what they did will never have a fully satisfactory answer. We can enumerate factors: the prolonged conflict, the grievances suffered, the mental health problems, the social isolation, the availability of weapons, the normalization of threats. But no enumeration of factors can fully explain the act of taking a weapon and shooting defenseless human beings. There is something in that act that resists analysis, that situates itself beyond what rational explanations can encompass. Perhaps that is the most frightening thing of all, that despite all our efforts to understand, there is something in extreme human violence that remains opaque, inaccessible, fundamentally incomprehensible. We can identify warning signs, we can take preventive measures, we can improve our systems of detection and response, but we cannot completely eliminate the possibility that someone, somewhere, will one day decide to convert their hatred into action and destroy innocent lives. This uncertainty is difficult to accept. We want to believe that we can control the world, that if we take the right precautions, we will be safe. Puerto Hurraco reminds us that this belief is ultimately an illusion. We can reduce risks, but not eliminate them. We can make it harder for tragedies like this one to occur, but not impossible. What we can do is learn from what happened, incorporate the lessons of Puerto Hurraco into our collective understanding of violence and how to prevent it. We can take verbal threats more seriously, especially when they are repeated and specific. We can create better mechanisms for intervention in prolonged conflicts before they escalate to the point of no return. We can foster community cultures where silence in the face of danger is less acceptable, where the responsibility to act is felt more acutely. None of these measures will guarantee that there will never be another Puerto Hurraco, but they can make it less likely, and that is already something. In a world where violence is an ever-present possibility, reducing the odds is the best we can hope for. The memory of the victims of Puerto Hurraco deserves to be honored, not only with monuments or ceremonies, but with concrete actions that contribute to preventing future tragedies. Every time someone takes seriously a threat they would previously have dismissed, every time a community intervenes in a conflict it would previously have ignored, every time a justice system acts preventively rather than just reactively. In a way, the memory of those who died that night in Puerto Hurraco is being honored. The names of the victims have become, over time, part of a tragic list that is recited at anniversaries and mentioned in retrospective reports. But those names represented real people, with lives, with dreams, with relationships, with everything that makes a human existence valuable. They had families who loved them, friends who missed them, stories that were cut short that night in a brutal and irreversible way. Remembering this is important because it helps to counteract the tendency to turn tragedy into abstraction. It is easy to speak of 9 dead as a statistic, as a number that represents the magnitude of the crime, but does not capture its human reality. It is harder, but more necessary, to remember that each of those dead was an individual person, with a life that was worth as much as any other, with a potential that will never be realized, with a place in the world that will remain empty forever. The women who died that night had their own stories, their own struggles, their own hopes. The men who fell under the izquierdos bullets left behind families who needed them, projects that remained unfinished, words they never got to say. The elderly people who were murdered carried with them decades of experience, of memory, of accumulated wisdom that was lost in an instant. Each death was an individual tragedy, in addition to being part of a collective tragedy. And then there were the survivors, those who were wounded but survived, those who witnessed the massacre but were not hit by bullets, those who arrived afterward and found the horror of bodies lying in the plaza. For them, that night marked the beginning of a long battle, not against an external enemy, but against the invisible aftermath of trauma, against memories that would not go away, against a world that suddenly seemed more dangerous and less comprehensible. The trauma of the Puerto Hurraco survivors took many forms. There were those who developed anxiety disorders, unable to feel safe anywhere. There were those who fell into deep depression, overwhelmed by a pain that seemed to have no bottom. There were those who turned to alcohol or drugs, looking for ways to numb a suffering that was unbearable. And there were those who somehow found ways to move forward, to integrate what had happened into their lives without being destroyed by it. Human resilience is remarkable, but it is neither infinite nor universal. Some people can survive extreme traumas and rebuild their lives in ways that seem almost miraculous. Others are permanently damaged, unable to regain the balance they had before the trauma occurred. The difference between some and others is not simply a matter of strength of character or willpower. It depends on complex factors that include social support, access to treatment, prior personal circumstances, and to some extent, pure luck. The survivors of Puerto Hurraco had to navigate these factors in a particularly difficult context. The village was small, resources limited, and media attention, though intense, was not always beneficial. Some received psychological help, others did not. Some found support networks, others found themselves alone. The recovery process was as diverse as the people who went through it. With the passage of years, the community of Puerto Hurraco survivors dispersed. Some remained in the village, others moved to nearby or distant cities. The bond that united them, the shared experience of that terrible night, was maintained in different ways, depending on the people and circumstances. There were those who kept in touch, who gathered at anniversaries, who found comfort in knowing that others had been through the same thing. And there were those who preferred to distance themselves, who found that contact with other survivors only served to revive memories they preferred to keep buried. The debate about how to remember Puerto Hurraco has evolved over the years. In the early days after the massacre, there was an urgency to understand, to explain, to make sense of what had happened. The media produced countless reports. Experts offered their analyses. Politicians made declarations. It was as if society needed to process the horror collectively, to talk about it until it was exhausted. Over time, this urgency diminished. Puerto Hurraco went from being front-page news to being an occasional memory, invoked when a similar case arose, or when a round anniversary was commemorated. The initial saturation gave way to a kind of selective amnesia, where the tragedy was remembered only at specific moments and in an increasingly superficial way. This generated tensions between those who wanted to keep the memory of what happened alive and those who preferred that the village could free itself from its identification with the massacre. There was no correct position in this debate. Both perspectives had their logic and legitimacy. The victims' families had the right to have their dead remembered, but the current inhabitants of the village also had the right to build an identity that went beyond that night. The way Puerto Hurraco has been represented in popular culture has also been a subject of controversy. There have been documentaries, books, even some fictional productions inspired by the events. Some of these representations have been respectful and rigorous. Others have fallen into sensationalism or simplification. The line between informing and exploiting others' pain is blurry, and it has not always been respected. The inhabitants of Puerto Hurraco and the survivors of the massacre have had little control over these representations. Their story has been told by others, often without consulting them, sometimes in ways they find inaccurate or hurtful. This loss of control over one's own narrative is one of the less visible but more persistent consequences of public tragedies. Victims and their families become characters in a story they did not choose to star in, and that others tell according to their own interests and criteria. Despite everything, Puerto Hurraco has found ways to continue existing beyond the tragedy. The village continues to function, with its seasonal cycles, its small routines, its daily life that continues regardless of what happened more than 30 years ago. The children who are born there today have no direct memory of the massacre. For them, it is something that happened before they existed, a story that is part of the past, of the place where they live, but that does not necessarily define their present or their future. This generational renewal is, in a way, the most natural way of processing collective trauma. Communities cannot live forever in the past. They need to look forward, to create new memories that layer over the old ones. This does not mean forgetting, but it does mean that the memory occupies a different place in collective consciousness, less omnipresent, less paralyzing. For Spain as a whole, Puerto Hurraco remains a name charged with meaning, though that meaning has evolved over time. It is no longer the urgent news it was in 1990, but a historical point of reference, an example that is invoked in certain contexts, a warning about the dangers of latent violence in seemingly peaceful communities. The question of what we can learn from Puerto Hurraco remains relevant, perhaps more than ever in a world where interpersonal and community conflicts continue to exist, where threats of violence continue to be made, where silence and normalization continue to be common responses to risk situations. Every time a neighborhood conflict escalates, every time warning signs are ignored, every time collective inaction allows a dangerous situation to develop unchecked, the lessons of Puerto Hurraco take on new relevance. And what happened that August night in 1990 was not a bolt from the blue. It was not an unpredictable accident. It was not the work of supernatural forces. It was the result of human actions, of decisions made or not made, of a process that developed over years before the eyes of a community that, for whatever reasons, failed to stop it. Understanding this is fundamental, because it means that what happened could have been avoided, and that what could happen in the future can, perhaps, be avoided as well. The day after the massacre, when the sun rose again over Puerto Hurraco, and the village had to face the reality of what had happened, a process began that still continues. A process of mourning, of reconstruction, of search for meaning, of trying to keep living despite everything. That process has no defined end, and because the effects of the tragedy extend in time in ways that are not always visible, but that remain real. The families of the victims continue to carry the weight of their loss, though they have learned to carry it in ways that allow them to function day to day. The survivors continue to deal with the aftermath, though they have found ways to integrate it into their lives. The village continues to exist under the shadow of its fame, though it has managed to create spaces of normality beyond it. All of this is part of the legacy of Puerto Hurraco, a legacy that goes far beyond the specific facts of that night. Summer nights in Extremadura have a particular quality, a mixture of residual heat and nighttime coolness that invites going out, gathering, enjoying the open air after the scorching days. In August 1990, Puerto Hurraco was preparing for its festivities, as it had done every year, not knowing that this would be the last time it would celebrate them in the same way, not knowing that the village's calendar would be split in two, before and after that night. The preparations had been the same as always, modest but exciting for a community that had few opportunities to celebrate throughout the year. The music was ready, families had gathered, emigrants had returned for the patron saint festivities, as was tradition. Puerto Hurraco was breathing that particular atmosphere of summer celebrations in small villages, where everyone knows everyone, and where the festival is as much an excuse to be together as a milestone in the monotonous rhythm of the rural year. The Cabanillas were there as every year, participating in the celebrations with their neighbors. They had no reason to stay home, or at least no reason that seemed sufficient to them. The Izquierdos' threats were old, so old that they had stopped seeming urgent. The danger had become part of the landscape, something they had learned to live with, as one lives with so many other inconveniences of life. The Izquierdos were also preparing that night, but their preparations were of a very different nature. They were not dressing for the festival, but for war. The shotguns they had been keeping for so long were finally going to fulfill their purpose. The hatred they had cultivated for decades was going to find its definitive expression. What was going through their minds in those preceding hours is something we will never know for certain. Later psychiatric reports speak of disorders, of distorted perceptions, of a parallel reality in which their actions had a logic that was inaccessible to others. But psychiatric reports cannot capture the subjective experience, the moment when a human being decides to cross a line that has no return. When they left their house armed and headed toward the plaza, where the festival was in full swing, did they think about the consequences of what they were going to do? Were they able to anticipate the horror they were about to unleash? Or were they so immersed in their hatred, so convinced of the justice of their cause, that the victims had ceased to be people and had become simply targets? These questions have no answer, and perhaps it is better that way. But there is something in the attempt to understand the assassins' minds that runs the risk of humanizing them in ways that may seem inappropriate, of diverting attention from the victims to the perpetrators. But at the same time, understanding is necessary if we want to prevent. And prevention requires understanding what leads people to commit acts that most of us consider inconceivable. The first shots must have sounded like something unreal to those who heard them. In the midst of the music and the bustle of the festival, the sound of the shotguns could have been confused with fireworks, with a vehicle's exhaust, with anything but what it really was. But the confusion lasted only a moment, because immediately after came the screams, the running, the chaos of a crowd that suddenly found itself under fire. The Izquierdo brothers shot without apparent discrimination, though their primary targets were clearly the Cabanillas. Anyone who was near them, anyone who got in their way, ran the same risk. The plaza became a death trap, with people running in all directions, seeking shelter where there was none, falling under bullets as they tried to flee. The massacre lasted minutes, but those minutes felt like hours for those who lived through them. Time dilates in situations of extreme terror. Every second becomes an eternity in which survival is the only concern. Those who manage to hide, those who manage to get far enough away, those who simply had the luck not to be in the trajectory of the bullets, those were the ones who lived to tell what had happened. When finally the shots ceased, when the Izquierdo brothers withdrew to their house, leaving behind a trail of death, Puerto Hurraco was plunged into a silence that was the antithesis of the bustle that had reigned moments before. It was the silence of consummated horror, the silence that follows catastrophe, the silence of a community that had just been destroyed. That night changed Puerto Hurraco forever. It changed the survivors, who would never be able to forget what they had seen. It changed the families of the victims, who would have to learn to live with irreparable losses. It changed even those who were not present, who returned to a village that was no longer what they had left. Nothing would ever be the same, because innocence, if it ever existed, had been destroyed in the most brutal way possible. The name of Puerto Hurraco remained etched in the Spanish collective memory as a synonym of rural tragedy, of atavistic violence, of the dangers of rooted resentment. It is a name that evokes images of blood and death, of truncated lives, of a village marked forever by what happened in it. But it is also the name of a place that continues to exist, that refuses to disappear, that seeks a future beyond its terrible past. The story of Puerto Hurraco is not just the story of a massacre. It is the story of the decades that preceded it, of the conflicts that took root, of the signals that were ignored, of the opportunities that were missed. It is the story of the years that followed, of the struggle to survive, of the attempts at reconstruction, of the search for meaning in the midst of meaninglessness. It is a complex, painful, unnecessary story. And it is a story that continues to be written because Puerto Hurraco is still there, under the sky of Extremadura, with its burden of memory and its hope for the future, waiting for someone to listen to what it has to tell. There is a reason why the story of Puerto Hurraco continues to resonate years after it first made the news. There is a reason why people return to this case, reflect on it, wonder about the fate of people they never knew. That reason is not just morbid fascination or intellectual curiosity. It is something deeper, something that forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the world we live in. All of us, in some way, exist at the mercy of systems. Our names in databases, our numbers in registries, our documents in archives. These are the threads that bind us to official existence, one that allow us to function in modern society, that prove we are who we claim to be. But Puerto Hurraco also reminds us of other threads, those that bind us to communities, to neighbors, to the people with whom we share space. These threads can be sources of support and belonging. But they can also become nooses that bind us, that strangle us, that turn everyday life into a hell of mutual distrust and growing hostility. The Izquierdo and Cabanillas families were bound by such threads for generations. Threads that over time had become chains, shackles, bonds impossible to break, that pulled both families toward the abyss. No one from outside came to cut these ties. No one offered an alternative to the spiral of hatred. No one said, "Enough." And when finally the end came, it was a bloody end, irreversible, leaving behind nothing but ruins and questions. Puerto Hurraco teaches us that small communities, which seem so idyllic seen from outside, can hide darkness that the outside observer has no idea of. It teaches us that proximity, which should breed solidarity, can also breed hatred, all the more intense the closer one lives. It teaches us that conflicts that seem trivial can over time take on monstrous proportions. But it also teaches us that life goes on, that even after the most terrible events, dawn comes, that communities, even the most wounded, can find ways to continue, that the memory of the past need not be a prison, but can become the foundation for a better future. Puerto Hurraco stands today as testimony to both these truths, as a reminder of how low humanity can fall, and as proof of how high it can rise, even emerging from the greatest darkness. This is the final lesson of this story, a lesson worth remembering, a lesson that must not be forgotten. Puerto Hurraco waits under the sky of Extremadura, with the weight of the past, and with a hope that despite everything, does not die. Because life, ultimately, is stronger than death, and memory, ultimately, is stronger than forgetting, and hope, ultimately, is stronger than despair. This is the message of Puerto Hurraco, a message written in blood and tears, but also a message written in the stubbornness of those who stayed, in the stubbornness of life that continues, despite everything, against everything. Puerto Hurraco, a name that means tragedy, but also a name that means survival. And perhaps one day, a name that will mean hope. That depends on us, on whether we learn the lessons, on whether we remember, on whether we do not allow this to happen again. Puerto Hurraco awaits our answer, and that answer is more important than all the questions this story poses. Looking back at that night, at the moment when the peace of the festivities was torn apart by gunshots, one can almost hear the echo of those sounds carrying across the decades. An echo that refuses to fade. An echo that demands to be heard. The victims of that night can no longer speak for themselves. They cannot tell their stories, express their dreams, share who they were beyond the role of victims that history has imposed on them. All that remain are memories in the hearts of those who knew them, photographs that fade over time, names on tombstones and in court records. But those names represented real people, people who had their everyday joys and sorrows, their plans and fears, their relationships and solitudes, people who that August night went out to celebrate, not suspecting that this night would be their last. Remembering them is not just an act of piety. It is an act of justice. It is an acknowledgement that their lives had value, that their deaths had meaning, that their stories deserve to be told and remembered. The Izquierdo brothers took their lives, but they cannot take their place in memory. They cannot take their meaning. They cannot make their existence be completely erased. As long as someone remembers, as long as someone tells the story, as long as someone invokes their names with respect and compassion, the victims of Puerto Hurraco live on, not in the literal sense, of course, but in the sense that has always mattered to humanity, in memory, in stories, in the lessons their fate can pass on to the living. This is the ultimate meaning of telling stories like this one, not to shock with horror, not to satisfy morbid curiosity, but to do justice to those who died and to teach those who live. Puerto Hurraco is a place. It is a tragedy. It is a warning. It is a lesson. But above all, it is a story of people. People who lived, loved, suffered, and died in a small village in Extremadura one August night more than 3 decades ago. Their story deserves to be told. Their memory deserves to endure. Their fate deserves to teach us something. Puerto Hurraco waits for us to hear, waits for us to remember, waits for us to draw conclusions, and waits for us to do everything in our power to ensure that such tragedies never happen again. That is the only answer that truly matters. The only answer that can give meaning to what would otherwise remain pure meaninglessness. The only answer that can honor the memory of those who died. Puerto Hurraco, August 1990. 9 human lives torn from this world. Countless lives changed forever. And a question that still hangs in the air. What will we do with this knowledge? What will we do with this memory? What will we do to make the future different? The answer belongs to us. And it is an answer that Puerto Hurraco still awaits. The landscape of Extremadura stretches out under a sun that seems to have no mercy. The fields are dry, the horizon shimmers with heat, and the villages that dot the plain seem to shrink under the weight of the sky. It is a harsh land, a land that has known poverty and abandonment, a land where survival has always required a certain kind of stubborn resilience. Puerto Hurraco is part of that landscape, a small village, increasingly small, that refuses to disappear despite everything that has happened, despite everything that has been said about it, despite the weight of a history that would have crushed lesser places. The streets of the village are quiet now. The plaza where so much blood was spilled has been cleaned, repaired, returned to something like normalcy. Children play there sometimes, unaware or only vaguely aware of what happened in that space before they were born. Life has a way of reclaiming spaces that death has marked. But for those who remember, for those who were there, for those who lost someone that night, the plaza will never be just a plaza again. It will always be the place where everything changed, where the accumulated hatred of decades finally exploded, where neighbors became targets and a summer festival became a slaughterhouse. The passage of time has not erased those memories. It has only made them different, given them a patina of distance that allows them to be looked at without being completely destroyed by them. The survivors have learned to live with what they witnessed, have found ways to function in a world that showed them its worst face that August night. Some have stayed in Puerto Hurraco because it is their home, because they have nowhere else to go, because leaving would feel like a final defeat. Others have scattered to the winds, seeking anonymity in cities where no one knows their name or their history. Both choices are valid. Both are ways of coping with the impossible. The years continue to pass. The village continues to shrink. The witnesses continue to age and, one by one, to pass away. Soon, there will be no one left who saw what happened with their own eyes. No one who can testify from personal experience to the horror of that night. When that happens, Puerto Hurraco will pass definitively from living memory to recorded history. It will become something studied in books, analyzed in documentaries, referenced in academic papers. The raw immediacy of trauma will give way to the cooler perspective of historical analysis. This is perhaps as it should be. Communities cannot live forever in the immediate aftermath of tragedy, and they need the passage of time to gain perspective, to heal, to move on. But there is also a danger in this transition, the danger that the lessons will be lost, that the intensity of the experience will fade until it becomes just another story, just another statistic. That is why it matters to keep telling this story, not to wallow in the horror, not to exploit the pain, but to ensure that what happened is not forgotten, that the warning it represents continues to be heard, that the lives that were lost continue to have meaning. Puerto Hurraco is still there, still waiting, still holding its secrets and its sorrows, its memories and its hopes. It is a small place, an insignificant point on the map, a village that would never have been known if not for what happened there one summer night. But it is also a mirror, and a mirror in which we can see reflected the dangers that lurk in any community, the hatred that can grow in any heart, the silence that can become complicity in any society. What happened in Puerto Hurraco could have happened anywhere. It could happen again, somewhere else, if we are not careful, if we do not learn, if we do not pay attention to the warning signs. That is the final message of this story. Not despair, but vigilance. Not fear, but awareness. Not hopelessness, but determination to do better, to be better, to create communities where such tragedies are less likely to occur. Puerto Hurraco waits for that message to be heard, and the responsibility of hearing it, of learning from it, of acting on it, belongs to all of us. When one thinks about Puerto Hurraco today, it is difficult not to feel a mixture of contradictory emotions. There is horror at what happened, compassion for the victims and their families, frustration at the missed opportunities for prevention, unease at the possibility that something similar could happen anywhere else. There are also questions that have no easy answers. Why? How? What could have been done differently? These questions are important, even if they do not have definitive answers. Keeping them alive is a form of resisting the temptation of forgetting, of complacency, of the belief that tragedies like this one are aberrations that will not repeat. History demonstrates that human violence is recurrent, that the conditions that generate it reproduce themselves time and again, that constant vigilance is the price of any security we can achieve. Puerto Hurraco is not unique, though it is singular. There are other places in Spain and in the world that have experienced comparable tragedies, massacres arising from prolonged conflicts, explosions of violence that no one managed to prevent despite the warning signs. Each of these cases has its own specific circumstances, but all share certain patterns: accumulated resentment, ignored threats, collective silence, late or non-existent intervention. Studying these patterns, identifying them when they appear, acting before it is too late, these are the practical lessons that can be drawn from Puerto Hurraco and other similar cases. They are not easy lessons to apply because they require resources, political will, and a willingness to intervene in conflicts that are often considered private or minor. But they are necessary lessons if we want to reduce the probability of future tragedies. The night of August 26, 1990, changed Puerto Hurraco forever, and everyone who was connected to it. It also changed, in less direct but equally real ways, Spanish society as a whole. It forced confrontation with realities that many prefer to ignore, questioning of systems that were taken for granted, recognition that violence is not something that only happens elsewhere, in other times, to other people. Time has passed, but the echo of those shots continues to resonate. It resonates in the memories of the survivors, in the absences left by the dead, in the collective memory of a country that cannot and should not forget what happened. And it also resonates in every present situation that bears similarities to the one that preceded the massacre, in every conflict that becomes entrenched, in every threat that is normalized, in every silence that is maintained where there should be intervention. Puerto Hurraco reminds us that tragedies have histories, that they do not arise from nothing, that they gestate for years or decades before manifesting themselves. It reminds us that we are responsible not only for our actions, but also for our omissions, for what we failed to do when we could have acted. It reminds us that the price of inaction can be immeasurably greater than the price of action, even if it does not seem so at the time. The conflict between the Izquierdos and the Cabanillas did not inevitably have to end in massacre. There were multiple points throughout decades where effective intervention could have changed the course of events. If the judicial system had acted differently after previous incidents, if the authorities had taken the repeated threats more seriously, if the community had found ways to mediate in the conflict, if the Izquierdos themselves had received the psychological help they clearly needed, perhaps none of this would have happened. These conditionals are, of course, exercises in speculation. We cannot know for certain what would have happened if things had been different. But what we do know is that things could have been different, that tragedy was not the only possible outcome, that there were opportunities that were not taken. This knowledge is painful, because it implies recognizing that the horror could have been avoided. But it is also valuable, because it suggests that future horrors can be avoided if we act differently. The story of Puerto Hurraco is, ultimately, a story about the fragility of social peace, about how easily things can go wrong when they are not given the necessary attention. It is a story about the consequences of abandonment, not only the abandonment of rural villages by the state, but the abandonment of conflicts by those who could intervene in them. It is a story about silence and its costs, about what happens when we prefer not to see what is in front of our eyes. But it is also a story about the persistence of life, about the ability of communities and individuals to survive even the worst tragedies. Puerto Hurraco continues to exist. The survivors continue to live. The memory of the victims continues to be honored by those who knew and loved them. Life continues, not because the tragedy did not matter, but precisely because it did. Because the only way to honor the dead is to keep living and learning from what happened. The sun continues to rise every morning over Puerto Hurraco, as it did before August 26, 1990, and as it has done every day since. The seasons continue to change, the years continue to pass, and the village is still there, resisting the passage of time and the tendency toward forgetting. It is a small village, increasingly small, but a village that exists, that has an identity beyond the tragedy, that refuses to be defined solely by the worst thing that ever happened to it. This resistance is, in its way, a form of triumph. Not a triumph over the Izquierdo brothers, who are already dead and cannot be retroactively defeated, but a triumph over despair, over the temptation to give up, over the idea that after something like this, nothing can ever have meaning again. Puerto Hurraco has found meaning, or at least has sought it, and in that search there is something profoundly human and profoundly admirable. Puerto Hurraco waits under the Extremaduran sky, and we must decide what answer we will give.